We talked about trees, and that was our other category of woody vegetation that you can find in Wisconsin. And emphasis still considering plants in Wisconsin, these are the shrubs. And shrubs, of course, different from trees. Not always 100% easy to tell the difference, but generally smaller, generally a little more branched from the ground level. So many more stems coming out near the ground level than your typical tree. And a bunch of groups that I'm going to categorize here that are mostly shrub groups and differentiated from other groups that are we talked about before that are more classically trees. So thinking about shrubs, it might be important to think about where you can find shrubs. So shrubs take advantage of some parts of habitat where their short stature sometimes is an advantage. So some of these habitats, for example, with less rainfall, such as these scrub habitats, this can be an advantageous place to be a shrub. Trees typically like things a little bit more wet, a little more precipitation, so drier areas sometimes end up with their woody plants only topping out as a shrub. And then a lot of these, I don't know if there's a lot of rhyme or reason, but these are places that I typically would think to find shrubs. So in the understories of forests, under a canopy of taller trees, there are also shrubby plants that do well in those low light conditions. And then a lot of edge habitat. So on the edges of wetlands, this is a nice place where it might not be perfectly great to be a tall tree that can make you vulnerable to falling over in soil that's not very firm. But if you're a shrub, you might not need as good a footing, and this is a good place to be a tall woody plant that's not quite a tree. Other edge habitats, forest edge, there might be some condition that's keeping this area open and this area more with trees. And on the edge of that is a good habitat, kind of an intermediate habitat where there's light level coming in from the side and intermediate conditions that don't quite favor trees and don't quite favor grasslands, for example. Similar to the pond edge, river habitats are also places you find a lot of shrubby plants. And then down here in the lower left, the pioneer communities, so places that have been altered dramatically by fire or mowing or farming or something like that, floods. If those are killing out a lot of plants, the trees take a while to get in there. Sometimes the shrubs are some of the first plants to get in. So as a community is changing and maybe becoming a forest over time, might be a shrubland first. So places that are more consistently shrubland around the world, this is a habitat, these kind of dry intermediate habitats are places where you typically find a lot of shrubby vegetation. As I mentioned, the woody places with big forests, they typically like more precipitation. So this is low precipitation habitats, and these have a kind of a similar environment in these different areas. So they call it a chaparral or a Mediterranean climate. We have some in Southern California. There's also Southern Africa and Southwestern Australia are some of the more classic habitats where you find these kinds of vegetation. And then it's also called Mediterranean. So obviously in the Mediterranean region, this purple color here. So these are areas that have like full biomes that are largely characterized by shrubs. So we'll start in with our first family here. This is going to be the family Cornaceae, and I'm going to ask you to learn it as a genus. So Cornus is a genus and gives its name to Cornaceae. Learning them as a genus is a little bit easier for you because you can learn for me the genus name as scientific name or a common name. So dogwoods, you might have heard of these before. Dogwoods are I mentioned in the trees lecture that there are some woody plants that have alternate, opposite phyllotaxis. So our trees that have opposite phyllotaxis include the maples, ashes, and dogwoods. MAD is a way to remember that as a mnemonic. And so this group does have some plants you would consider trees. For us, it's more, I'd say more of a shrub. More typically, you'd find these as shrubs. And quite a few species just in this genus Cornus. So the family has other genera, but we're not going to worry about those at the moment. And they have opposite leaves, but not always. So there's some notable species that do not have opposite leaves. And I guess you'd have to maybe patch those into what you already know about Cornaceae and the genus Cornus. One way to tell these plants, actually a couple ways, you can use just their leaves. One feature that kind of starts giving them away is this venation. So the venation is pinnate. but then it starts to angle towards the tips. So this is a feature called arcuate venation, where the leaves start out being pinnate and then kind of roll around towards the tips, kind of characteristic venation for cornice. Another feature that's also related to these leaves is that they have these fibrous connective structures in their veins. So the veins have a little bit more toughness to them, I guess, as you pull them apart. You can do this thing that you can call the cornice test. So if you think you have a dogwood, you take the leaf and you break it apart, but not like so drastically that you tear everything. If you take it gently broken apart and you leave it as that, just this little distance that's shown here, the remaining veins still kind of hold on to each other. So that can be a good test, and I don't know, something to impress your friends with, the cornice test. So leaf venation, usually opposite phyllotaxis, funny little veins there. And a little bit of variety in how the flowers are put together. So for our species, the inflorescence is a little bit less remarkable, just a panicle, and that's most of the species you can find around us. And there are other species, one that I'll point out that we do have in northern Wisconsin, and then maybe a little more of the classic southern dogwood plants. They have this false inflorescence, inflorescence that kind of looks like a flower. So now we've seen this a few times in a few different plant families. Here's another case where we've got individual flowers here. I'll show you a zoom in of one of those in a little bit. Individual flowers grouped together, and then they have these big showy bracts that are helpful for attracting pollinators. So the pollinators see the white bracts. Those are not flower parts on their own. They're just leaves that are white, and they attract insects in to visit the flowers. And just to illustrate for you what's going on in there, they are in fact good flowers in there. And this is another one of those groups where the number of petals is a little more, usually 4. So in a lot of our eudicots, it's 5 petals. This is one where it's often 4, not always, but you can see individual flowers there. So commonly with 4 petals, as I just mentioned. Here's a couple more examples of those inflorescences. Maybe not so much remarkable about the flowers themselves. We got a lot that we could use to identify them based on them being woody and having that particular leaf venation. The fruits are drupes. And here's a case where a drupe can have more than one seed. So I mentioned that the drupe fruit type is not, it's not defined by having only one seed. We often think of them that way, like a cherry or a peach. These are drupes. Our familiar drupes are often one seed at a time, but they can have more than one. So here's a case. And one of the species that we have in our state is illustrated in the upper right here. This is one, it's called the bunchberry, and grows close to the ground, but it is in fact a fairly woody plant. If you get this plant isolated, it's got like a woody rhizome. Grows in more northern climates, and so it experiences harsh winters, and it's kind of adapted to live close to the ground to keep itself protected. But it does have those separate flowers in the center, and then these big bracts, 4 bracts associated with them. Bunchberry there, I had the fruiting version of that. This is fruiting bunchberry here. So a little variety in the drupe color in dogwoods. So we'll just go ahead and call the whole genus dogwood, although there is this common name bunchberry sometimes.